The old leather chair creaked like my bones as I settled into Pastor Bill's office, my weathered hands trembling worse than they had since Vietnam. The afternoon sun slanted through those dusty windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach right into my guilty soul. "Preacher," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I done something that'll either damn my soul or save it." Pastor Bill leaned forward, his kind eyes never leaving mine. 40 years he'd been listening to the sins of Millfield, but I could see this one had him concerned already. "The truth has a way of finding you, Bobby, even when you're not looking for it," he said gently, folding his hands. "What's eating at you, son?" I stared down at my shaking fingers, thinking about that German shepherd lying out there in my truck, probably wondering why his old fool of a master was taking so long. 3 months we'd been together now, and every single day had been built on a lie so big it could choke a horse. "Pastor," I finally managed, "what I'm about to tell you, it's about Danny's dog. About what I knew and what I didn't say. About the choice I made that might have saved us both, or might have destroyed what's left of this family." The words hung in the air like smoke from an old cigarette, bitter and lingering. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months back, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, I was heading to Miller's Hardware for some fence wire when I saw what looked like a pile of old rags beside the entrance. But as I got closer, my heart just about stopped in my chest. It was a German shepherd, and Lord Almighty, he was in bad shape. His ribs were showing through matted fur, his breathing shallow and labored. Those deep brown eyes that should have been bright and alert were glazed with pain and something else, something that looked an awful lot like giving up. "Easy there, boy," I whispered, kneeling down slow. The poor creature could barely lift his head, but when he did, those eyes locked onto mine with a look that hit me like a sucker punch. It was recognition, Pastor. Not the kind where a dog meets a stranger, but something deeper, something that made my chest tighten up like a fist. That's when I noticed his collar, or what was left of it. Someone had taken a knife or scissors to the leather, cutting it clean off. The edges were still fresh, meaning this wasn't some accident. This beautiful animal had been abandoned on purpose, left to die like yesterday's garbage. My hands were shaking when I called Doc Morrison. "Lizzie, I need you down at Miller's Hardware right now. Found a German shepherd in real bad shape." She arrived faster than a fire truck, took one look at that dog, and her face went white. "Bobby, this boy's been on his own for days, maybe a week, dehydrated, malnourished, and look at these cuts on his paws. He's been walking on rough ground for miles." As we lifted him onto the makeshift stretcher, something happened that still gives me chills. That dog, weak as he was, reached out with his front paw and placed it right on my hand. Gentle as you please, like he was trying to say thank you, or maybe like he was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear. "I tell you, Pastor, when I first laid eyes on that dog, something in my chest just broke wide open," I continued, my voice getting rougher. "See, I'd been walking around for 2 years feeling like half a man, ever since we buried my Danny, lost my boy in Afghanistan, then lost my Margaret to cancer 6 months later. Thought I was done feeling anything at all. But this dog, lying there more dead than alive, stirred something in me I thought was buried with my family. Maybe it was his dignity in the face of abandonment, or maybe it was the way he looked at me like he knew exactly what kind of pain I was carrying. Sometimes God puts broken things in your path so you can fix yourself, I told the pastor, watching his face for judgment that never came. That was the beginning of everything, Pastor Bill. The beginning of the biggest lie I ever told, and maybe the most important truth I ever stumbled into. Pastor Bill, I lied to that dog from the very first day, and maybe that lie is what's eating me alive. I shifted in that old chair, feeling the weight of 3 months' worth of deception pressing down on my shoulders like a rucksack full of stones. The truth was, I recognized something about that German shepherd the moment I laid eyes on him, but I pushed it down deep, told myself I was imagining things. You see, preacher, when my Danny came back from his second tour in Afghanistan, he wasn't the same boy who'd left PTSD, they called it. Nightmares, flashbacks, the whole 9 yards. The army gave him a therapy dog, a beautiful German shepherd they'd trained special for soldiers like him. I paused, remembering Danny's face the day he brought that dog home. First genuine smile I'd seen from my boy in months. Called him Ranger. That dog could sense when Danny was having a bad day before Danny even knew it himself. Would nudge him awake from nightmares, block strangers from getting too close when Danny was feeling jumpy. Saved my boy's life more than once, I reckon. Pastor Bill nodded, understanding already where this was heading. And when Danny died, that's where it gets complicated. I rubbed my temples, feeling one of those headaches coming on again. The funeral was, well, you remember how it was. Melissa was beside herself, crying like her heart was torn clean out. She kept saying how she'd take care of everything Danny loved, how she'd honor his memory. The memory of that day still stung like salt in a wound. My daughter-in-law, all of 28 years old, suddenly a widow with no children, and a whole life ahead of her. I'd felt sorry for her, protective even. Should have known better. Few weeks after we buried Danny, I asked Melissa how Ranger was doing. She got real quiet, said the dog was having a hard time adjusting, that maybe it would be better if he went to live with someone who could give him more attention, said she was thinking about finding him a new home. I stood up, paced to the window, looking out at my truck where Braveheart, that's what I'd started calling him, was waiting patiently. I told her that was probably for the best. Said Danny would want his dog to be happy, to help other folks if he could. Biggest mistake I ever made, Pastor. I should have insisted on taking him myself. But you didn't know. Didn't know what? That she'd sell him to some dealer who'd dump him the minute he became inconvenient? That she'd cut off his collar and leave him to die rather than do right by my son's memory? My voice was rising, and I forced myself to calm down. No, I didn't know. But I should have. A father should know when his son's legacy is in danger. I sat back down, my legs suddenly feeling unsteady. When Doc Morrison and I got that dog to her clinic, she started noticing things. The way he responded to commands, how he'd position himself between me and the door, classic protection behavior. She mentioned he'd obviously had professional training. "Bobby," she said, "this isn't just any dog. This is military trained. Somebody spent serious money and time on this animal." And I just stood there, looking her right in the eye, and said I'd never seen him before in my life. The weight of that lie still sat heavy on my conscience. Doc Morrison had been more than just Danny's veterinarian. She'd been his high school sweetheart before he joined up. They'd stayed friends even after he married Melissa, and she'd helped with Ranger's care during Danny's worst episodes. "Why didn't you tell her the truth?" Pastor Bill asked gently. Because admitting I recognized him meant admitting I'd failed my son. Again. My voice cracked like old leather. I failed to keep him safe in Afghanistan. I failed to save my wife from cancer. And I failed to protect the one living thing that carried his memory. I pulled out my handkerchief, wiped my eyes before the tears could fall. 70-year-old men don't cry in front of preachers, even ones they've known for decades. But there's more, Pastor. Things I started noticing as that dog got stronger. He'd wake up in the middle of the night and pace the clinic, like he was doing security rounds. When Doc Morrison would raise her voice at her assistant, he'd move between them, real subtle-like. And when she played country music on the radio, Danny's favorite, that dog would perk up his ears and get this look in his eyes. Like he was remembering. Exactly, like he was remembering my boy. I steadied myself with a deep breath. So I started putting pieces together. Melissa had told me she found Ranger a good home, but she never said where. Never gave me a phone number or address to check on him. And when I asked about it a few months later, she got defensive, said I needed to let Danny rest in peace. "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes," I quoted, one of my daddy's favorite sayings. And I'd been helping that lie along every step of the way. The hardest part was watching that dog recover, seeing him learn to trust again, knowing all the while that I was just another person keeping secrets from him. Every time he'd look at me with those trusting brown eyes, I felt like a fraud. In war, you learn that sometimes the hardest enemy to face is yourself, I continued. I spent 3 months in Vietnam learning that lesson, and here I was, 50 years later, still fighting the same battle. Pastor Bill leaned back in his chair, processing everything I'd told him. "So what did you do with these suspicions?" "What any old fool would do," I said, managing a bitter laugh. "I started digging where I shouldn't have been digging, and Pastor, what I found, it changed everything." I looked out the window again, watching Braveheart's ears perk up as he spotted me through the glass. That dog had been waiting patiently for over an hour, never once trying to leave the truck, never once giving up on me coming back. Just like he'd probably waited for Danny, just like he'd probably waited for Melissa to change her mind. The truth has a way of surfacing, doesn't it, Pastor? Like a cork in deep water. You can hold it down for a while, but eventually it's going to pop up and smack you right in the face. I settled back in my chair, preparing for the hardest part of my confession. What I found out about Melissa, about what really happened to Danny's dog. It near about broke what was left of my faith in family. But it also showed me what I had to do to make things right. So I did what any old fool would do. I started digging where I shouldn't have been digging. I leaned forward in that chair, my voice dropping to almost a whisper. Pastor Bill had that look on his face, the one he got when he knew the real story was just beginning to unfold. First place I went was to see Tommy Rodriguez down at the VFW. He'd served with Danny in Afghanistan, came home about the same time. If anyone would know about Danny's dog, it'd be Tommy. I remember that conversation like it was yesterday. Tommy was working on his old Chevy in his driveway, grease up to his elbows when I pulled up. Soon as I mentioned Danny's therapy dog, his whole demeanor changed. "Mr. O'Sullivan," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've been wondering about Ranger for months. That dog was Danny's lifeline over there. Saved his bacon more than once when the nightmares got bad. Whatever happened to him?" That's when my heart started sinking, Pastor. Because Tommy's question told me everything I needed to know. If Melissa had really found Ranger a good home like she claimed, she would have told Danny's army buddies. These boys looked out for each other, and they would have wanted to know that dog was being taken care of proper. I told Tommy I wasn't sure, that Melissa had handled the arrangements. His face got real serious then. "Sir," he said, "you need to know something. About 2 months after the funeral, I called Melissa to ask about visiting Ranger. Thought it might help me deal with losing Danny, you know. She told me the dog had died, said he got hit by a car just a few weeks after Danny's service." My hands started shaking again, just like they had that day in Tommy's driveway. The lie was bigger than I'd imagined, and it was spreading like cancer through everything Danny had left behind. I asked Tommy if he'd heard this from anyone else, and that's when he really dropped the hammer. Turns out 3 other boys from Danny's unit had called Melissa about the dog. She told each one a different story. Car accident to Tommy, cancer to Miguel Santos and to Bobby Chen. Told him she'd had to put the dog down because he was too aggressive with strangers. Pastor Bill shook his head slowly. 4 different stories. 4 different lies, I corrected. Each one designed to make sure nobody would come looking for that dog. And it worked, too. Those boys were grieving Danny so hard, they didn't think to compare notes. That's when I knew I had to dig deeper, even though every instinct told me I wasn't going to like what I found. I spent the next week making phone calls, visiting places, following a trail that got colder and more heartbreaking with every step. Went down to the county animal shelter first. Talked to Mary Beth Williams, the manager there. She remembered Danny, remembered when he'd come in with Ranger for his monthly checkups. but she said they hadn't seen hide nor hair of that dog since Danny died. The next stop was the military base where Danny had been stationed stateside. The K-9 unit there kept records of all their therapy dogs, and that's where I hit pay dirt, and where my heart broke clean in two. Sergeant Martinez pulled up Ranger's file on his computer, told me the dog was worth about $15,000, all that specialized training and such. But here's the kicker, Pastor. The military keeps track of their therapy dogs even after they're placed with veterans. They check in regular-like, make sure the dogs are healthy and doing their job. I had to stop talking for a minute, the anger still burning in my chest like acid. According to their records, Ranger had been sold to a commercial dog dealer in Houston 3 months after Danny's funeral. Not placed with another veteran, not retired to a loving family, sold like a piece of equipment to the highest bidder. Pastor Bill's face went pale. Melissa sold Danny's therapy dog? Got $8,000 for him, according to the receipt I found when I pressed her about it. 8,000 pieces of silver for betraying my son's memory. I wiped my eyes, not caring any more about crying in front of the preacher. That dealer in Houston, he specialized in what they call problem dogs, animals that were too expensive to keep if they didn't work out perfect in their new homes. The trail from Houston had gone cold, but I had enough pieces to put the puzzle together. Ranger had been sold to someone who expected a perfectly trained pet, not a therapy dog dealing with his own trauma from losing his handler. When the dog showed signs of grief, probably refusing to eat, maybe howling at night, maybe being protective of spaces that reminded him of Danny, his new owners had given up on him. Blood may be thicker than water, but loyalty runs deeper than blood, I told Pastor Bill, quoting something my own daddy used to say. That dog stayed loyal to Danny even after Danny was gone. But the people who should have honored that loyalty, they threw him away like garbage. The confrontation with Melissa had been inevitable, but I'd put it off as long as I could. When I finally worked up the courage to drive over to her new place across town, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. She answered the door looking like she'd seen a ghost, Pastor. Soon as she saw my face, she knew I'd figured it out. We sat in her kitchen, and for the first time since Danny's funeral, I saw the real Melissa, not the grieving widow, but a scared young woman who'd made a terrible choice and been living with it ever since. I couldn't stand it, Bobby, she said, crying so hard she could barely get the words out. Every morning that dog would sit by Danny's truck, waiting for him to come home. Every night he'd scratch at Danny's bedroom door. I was trying to move on, trying to heal, and that dog kept pulling me back into the grief. I understood her pain, Pastor. I really did. But understanding and forgiving are two different things entirely. So you sold him, I said. You took the one living thing that loved my son unconditionally, and you sold him to strangers. She nodded, couldn't even look me in the eye. I thought he'd be happier with someone else. I thought it would be better for both of us. Sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you'd die to protect, I continued, feeling the truth of those words in my bones. I wanted to be angry at her, Pastor. Lord knows I had every right. But sitting there in that kitchen, looking at this broken girl who'd been carrying her own guilt for 2 years, I realized something important. What's that, Bobby? We were both grieving Danny, just in different ways. She was trying to forget him so she could move on, and I was trying to remember him so I wouldn't feel so lost. Neither one of us was handling it right, and that poor dog paid the price for our mistakes. The weight of that realization had settled on me like a lead blanket. Melissa and I were both responsible for what happened to Ranger, even if we'd failed him in different ways. And now, 3 months later, I was sitting in a church confessional, trying to figure out how to make amends for sins that couldn't be undone. But Pastor, I said, my voice getting stronger, there's more to this story, because sometimes God gives you a second chance, even when you don't deserve it. Pastor, there's something else I ain't told nobody, not even you, the doctors. They say my mind's going. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a funeral pyre. Pastor Bill's kind eyes widened, and I could see him trying to process what I'd just laid on him. Truth was, I'd been carrying this secret for 6 months now, ever since Doc Patterson down at the medical center had given me the news that changed everything. Started noticing things about 4 months before I found that dog, I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. Little things at first. Forgetting where I put my keys, losing track of conversations halfway through. Margaret always said I was absent-minded, so I didn't think much of it. I shifted in that old chair, feeling every one of my 67 years pressing down on my shoulders. But then it got worse. I'd be driving down roads I'd traveled 1,000 times and suddenly not recognize where I was. I'd call people by the wrong names, forget appointments I'd made just the day before. The memory of that doctor's appointment still made my stomach churn. Doc Patterson, bless his heart, had tried to be gentle about it, but there's no easy way to tell a man his mind is betraying him. "Bobby," he said, looking at those test results, "what we're seeing here suggests early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Now it's progressing slowly, and we've got medications that might help, but I want you to understand what we're dealing with." Pastor Bill leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together. "How long do you have?" "Could be 2 years, could be 10, no way to know for sure." I rubbed my temples, feeling that familiar fog creeping in around the edges of my thoughts. "Good days and bad days," he said. "Some days I'll be sharp as a tack. Other days I might not remember my own name." The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Just when I'd found Danny's dog, just when I had a chance to make things right, my own mind was starting to slip away like water through a broken dam. That's why I lied to Doc Morrison about recognizing the dog, Pastor. I was scared that if I admitted the truth, if I told people what I suspected, they'd say I was just confused, that my failing memory was making me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew better. Some things go deeper than memory, deeper than the brain's ability to store and retrieve information. The connection I felt to that German shepherd wasn't just recognition. It was something more primal, more fundamental. "A man's not truly gone until the last person who remembers him dies," I said, quoting something I'd heard at Danny's funeral. "Problem is, Pastor, what happens when the person doing the remembering starts to forget?" That question had been haunting me for months. Every night, I'd sit in my kitchen with a notebook, writing down everything I could remember about Danny. His favorite foods, the way he laughed at his own jokes, the sound of his voice when he called me from overseas. I was racing against time, trying to preserve his memory before my own mind betrayed me completely. The dog became my lifeline, you understand. If I was going to lose my memories of Danny, at least I could make sure something that loved him kept walking around on 4 legs. I pulled out a worn photograph from my wallet. Danny in his uniform, kneeling beside Ranger, both of them squinting in the Afghan sun. My hands trembled as I showed it to Pastor Bill. I keep this with me all the time now. Some days when the fog gets thick, it's the only way I can remember what my boy looked like. My voice cracked like old leather. Memory is the only paradise from which we cannot be driven, Pastor. But what do you do when paradise starts crumbling around you? The diagnosis had changed everything about how I approached life. Every conversation became precious, every moment of clarity a gift to be treasured. And that dog, Braveheart, as I'd come to call him, became my anchor to the present, my connection to the son I was slowly forgetting. That's why I started training little Jake to help with the dog. My great-nephew's only 8, but he's got a good heart and gentle hands. I figure if I teach him everything I know about caring for Braveheart while I still can, then maybe Danny's memory will live on through both of them. The training sessions with Jake had become the highlight of my week. The boy had a natural way with animals, and Braveheart had taken to him like a duck to water. Together, we'd work on commands, feeding schedules, and the special techniques Danny had taught me for handling the dog's occasional anxiety attacks. "Grandpa Bobby," Jake said to me just last week, "why does Braveheart sometimes stare at the door like he's waiting for someone?" And I had to explain to an 8-year-old boy about loyalty and loss and the way love can outlast the people who feel it. Pastor Bill nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what I was carrying. "You're trying to create a legacy." "More than that," I said. "I'm trying to create a living memory, something that can carry Danny's love forward even when I can't remember his face." The cruel mathematics of Alzheimer's meant that every day of clarity was one day closer to the darkness. I'd started leaving myself notes around the house, reminders about taking medication, about feeding the dog, about the names of people who mattered. My kitchen table looked like a command center, covered with sticky notes and photographs and lists of things I couldn't afford to forget. Some mornings I wake up and for just a moment I forget that Danny's gone. I'll think about calling him, or I'll set an extra place at the breakfast table. Those moments are both a blessing and a curse, Pastor. They let me live in a world where my boy is still alive, but they also remind me how far I've already fallen. The dog seemed to sense my condition, too. On my bad days, when the confusion got thick, Braveheart would stay close, nudging me gently when I got disoriented, leading me back to familiar spaces. It was like he was returning the favor, taking care of the old man who'd taken care of him. If I'm going to lose my memories, Pastor, I want to make sure the important ones keep walking around on 4 legs, I continued. That dog remembers Danny in ways I'm starting to forget. The way he'd sit on the porch waiting for Danny to come home from work. The special whistle Danny used to call him in from the yard. The way he'd rest his head on Danny's lap when the nightmares got bad. I paused, watching a pair of cardinals through the window, their bright red feathers a splash of color against the gray November sky. Margaret had always said cardinals were messengers from heaven, bringing news from loved ones who'd passed on. The hardest part isn't forgetting the big things, Pastor. It's losing the little details that made Danny who he was. The way he'd wrinkle his nose when he laughed, the sound he made when he was thinking hard about something, the particular way he'd scratch behind that dog's ears. But Braveheart remembered those details, in the way he tilted his head when he heard country music on the radio, in the way he'd perk up when he saw a man in uniform, in the way he'd sometimes look at me with those intelligent brown eyes, and I could swear he was seeing Danny's face in mine. That's why I had to find out the truth about what happened to him, Pastor. And that's why, when I finally confronted Melissa about it, I had to make a choice between my anger and my time. Because when you don't know how many good days you have left, you can't afford to waste them on grudges. I looked directly at Pastor Bill, my eyes clear and focused, despite the tremor in my hands. The truth was, we were all grieving Danny in our own way. And sometimes grief makes people do terrible things, even to the ones they should be protecting. I finally worked up the courage to face that girl, and Lord help me, what came out of that conversation? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that November afternoon settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat. Pastor Bill had poured himself a cup of coffee, and the steam rising from his mug reminded me of the fog that had been rolling through my mind more frequently those days. Drove over to Melissa's new place on Maple Street, the little blue house she'd bought with her new husband. My hands were shaking so bad I had to sit in the truck for 10 minutes just to work up the nerve to knock on her door. The memory was still crystal clear, one of those moments that seemed to have burned itself permanently into whatever was left of my functioning brain. Melissa had answered the door wearing a yellow sundress, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking younger than her 32 years. But when she saw my face, when she recognized the determination in my eyes, all that youthful color drained right out of her cheeks. "Bobby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I think you know, sweetheart," I told her. "We need to talk about Danny's dog." She'd invited me into her kitchen, the same way she had a dozen times when she was married to my son. But everything was different now. New curtains, new furniture, pictures of her new husband where Danny's photos used to hang. It was like walking into a museum exhibit titled, "Life After My Son Died." We sat at her kitchen table, and for the longest time, neither one of us said a word. Just sat there looking at each other, both knowing we were about to have a conversation that would change everything. Pastor Bill nodded, encouraging me to continue. Finally, I pulled out that receipt I'd gotten from the military base, the one showing Ranger had been sold to that dealer in Houston. Laid it right there on the table between us like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "I know what you did, Melissa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know you sold Danny's dog to some dealer who probably dumped him the first time he became inconvenient. What I don't know is why." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear the clock on her kitchen wall ticking, could hear her new husband's television playing in the living room, could hear my own heart beating like a war drum in my chest. Then she just broke down, Pastor. Started crying so hard, I thought she might make herself sick. And through those tears, the whole ugly truth came pouring out like water through a busted dam. "I couldn't stand it, Bobby," she sobbed, her hands covering her face. "Every morning that dog would sit by Danny's truck, waiting for him to come home. Every night he'd scratch at Danny's bedroom door, whining like his heart was breaking. I was trying to move on, trying to heal, and that dog kept pulling me back into the grief." I remembered feeling my anger rising like bile in my throat, but also recognizing something in her pain that I understood all too well. We were both drowning in our own ways, both trying to survive the loss of the person who'd been the center of our worlds. "So you sold him," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. "You took the one living thing that loved my son unconditionally, and you sold him to strangers for $8,000. She nodded, still crying, still unable to look me in the eye. "I thought he'd be happier with someone else. I thought it would be better for both of us. I thought maybe if I got rid of everything that reminded me of Danny, the pain would stop." "And did it?" I asked her. "Did selling my son's dog make the pain stop?" That's when she looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes that caught me completely off guard. It wasn't just guilt or shame or regret. It was relief, like she'd been carrying this secret so long it had become a physical weight, and finally having it out in the open was like setting down a heavy suitcase after a long journey. "No," she whispered. "It made everything worse. Because then, I wasn't just grieving Danny. I was living with the knowledge of what I'd done to his memory. And I couldn't tell anyone, couldn't ask for help dealing with the guilt because I knew how it would sound." Pastor Bill leaned back in his chair, processing what I was telling him. She was carrying her own burden. That's when the real bombshell dropped, Pastor. Because that girl looked me right in the eye and said, "Bobby, I know about your condition. I know about the Alzheimer's." My blood went cold when she said those words. I'd been so careful, so determined to keep my diagnosis private until I could figure out how to handle it. But apparently, I hadn't been as careful as I thought. "How?" I asked her, and she explained that she'd run into Doc Patterson at the grocery store a few weeks earlier. He'd let it slip, thinking she already knew, since she was family. Said he was worried about me living alone, managing my medications, taking care of myself. The irony was bitter as black coffee. Here I was, confronting her about keeping secrets, and she'd been keeping one of mine without even telling me she knew. "That's when I realized," she continued, "that we were both carrying secrets that were eating us alive. You knew about the dog, and I knew about your diagnosis. We were both protecting each other from truths that were too painful to speak out loud. The truth will set you free, but first it'll make you miserable," I told Pastor Bill, quoting something my own father used to say. And sitting in that kitchen with Melissa, I felt more miserable than I had since the day we buried Danny. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of the confrontation I'd been dreading, instead of the anger and accusations I'd prepared myself for, we started talking. Really talking. For the first time since Danny's funeral. "Bobby," she said, "I need you to understand something. When I sold Ranger, I was 6 weeks pregnant." That revelation hit me like a physical blow. Melissa, pregnant with another man's child while she was still grieving my son. The complexity of human emotion, the way love and loss and hope and fear can all tangle together into something too complicated for simple judgment. "I found out 2 days after I'd already called the dealer," she continued. "I was carrying new life, trying to build a future with a man who loved me, and every day that dog was reminding me of the husband I'd lost. I couldn't handle it, Bobby. I just couldn't handle loving the past and the future at the same time. We all got our reasons for the things we do. Some are just harder to live with," I said, understanding her pain, even if I couldn't forgive her actions. That's when she dropped the second bombshell, Pastor. She looked at me across that kitchen table and said, "I'll make you a deal. I'll keep your secret about the Alzheimer's if you keep mine about the dog. We'll both carry our guilt, and we'll both try to do better going forward." It was like a standoff in an old Western movie. Two people pointing guns at each other, both knowing that pulling the trigger would destroy them both. Mutual assured destruction, they called it in the war. But then she said something that changed everything. "Bobby, is that really Danny's dog you found?" And when I nodded, she started crying again. But this time it was different. This time it was relief mixed with something that looked almost like joy. "I've been praying for 2 years that someone would find him," she whispered. "I've been hoping that maybe, somehow, he'd end up with someone who would love him the way Danny did. When I heard you'd found a German Shepherd, I wondered, but I was too scared to ask." That's when I realized that Melissa wasn't the villain in the story, Pastor. She was just another casualty of grief, another person trying to survive the aftermath of losing someone they loved. And in that moment, sitting in her kitchen with all our secrets laid bare between us, I made a decision that would change everything. Sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you die to protect, I said, looking Pastor Bill directly in the eye. And sometimes protecting them means forgiving them, even when they don't deserve it. Pastor, I came closer to doing something unforgivable than I ever did in Vietnam. The weight of those words settled between us like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of silence through the small office. Pastor Bill's coffee had gone cold, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on mine, and I could see the concern there, the pastoral instinct that had been honed over 40 years of listening to confessions and offering comfort to troubled souls. It was 3 weeks ago, right after that conversation with Melissa. I'd been carrying the weight of everything, the Alzheimer's, the truth about the dog, the knowledge that my time was running out faster than sand through an hourglass. And that particular Thursday evening, something in my mind just snapped. I paused, my hands trembling more violently now as the memory came flooding back. It had been during one of our regular therapy visits to the elementary school. Little Jake had been there, along with a handful of other children who'd been struggling with their own family troubles. Braveheart was doing what he did best, offering quiet comfort to kids who needed it most. We were in Mrs. Peterson's classroom, working with a little girl named Sarah whose daddy had been deployed overseas. She was reading to Braveheart, her small hands buried in his fur, when suddenly the room started spinning around me like a carnival ride. The episode had come without warning, one of those moments when the fog in my brain became so thick I couldn't see through it. 1 minute I was watching Sarah practice her reading, the next minute I was back in the jungles of Vietnam, hearing Danny's voice calling for help through the static of a radio that existed only in my failing memory. I couldn't remember where I was, Pastor. Couldn't remember the year. Couldn't remember that Danny was gone. Couldn't even remember my own name for a few terrible minutes. All I knew was that there were children around me, and I was supposed to be protecting them, but I didn't know from what. Mrs. Peterson had handled the situation with remarkable grace, quickly moving the children to another part of the classroom while Jake, bless that boy's heart, stayed close to me, his small hand on my arm, his voice steady and calm as he tried to bring me back to the present. "Grandpa Bobby," he kept saying, "it's okay. You're safe. Braveheart's here. I'm here. Everything's going to be okay." That 8-year-old boy had more sense than I did in that moment. But it was Braveheart's response that had truly amazed everyone in the room. The dog, sensing my distress, had immediately moved into position beside me, his warm body pressed against my legs, his intelligent eyes focused on my face with an intensity that cut through the confusion like a searchlight through fog. That dog knew exactly what to do, Pastor. He'd done it for Danny 100 times, guided him through the flashbacks, grounded him when the memories got too real. And there he was, doing the same thing for me, like he'd been trained for this moment his whole life. The ride home that evening had been quiet, Jake sitting in the passenger seat while Braveheart rode in the back, all of us processing what had happened in our own ways. But when we got to my house, when Jake's mother came to pick him up, that's when the real darkness descended. I sat in my kitchen after they left, staring at the bottle of bourbon I keep in the cabinet above the sink. Margaret always said I drank too much when I was troubled, and Lord knows I was troubled that night. The bottle had called to me like a siren song, promising temporary relief from the weight of everything I was carrying. But even drunk, even lost in my own despair, I knew that alcohol wouldn't solve anything. It would just make the fog in my brain thicker, the confusion more complete. That's when I saw Danny's old service pistol sitting in the drawer of my desk, Pastor. The Army had sent it back with his personal effects, along with his medals and his letters home. I'd kept it cleaned and oiled, more out of habit than any real purpose. Pastor Bill's face went pale, but he didn't interrupt. He understood that some confessions required complete honesty, no matter how dark the truth might be. I sat there in my kitchen, holding that gun, thinking about how easy it would be to just end it, to stop being a burden to the people who loved me, to stop worrying about forgetting Danny's face, to stop feeling like half a man in a world that demanded wholeness. The weight of the pistol in my hands had felt like salvation and damnation all rolled into one. It would have been so simple. One moment of courage or cowardice, depending on how you looked at it, and all the pain would stop. But then Braveheart came into the kitchen, Pastor. Walked right up to me and laid his big head in my lap, just like he'd done with Danny during his darkest moments. And I swear to you, it was like that dog could see straight into my soul. The moment stretched out like eternity. An old man with a gun in one hand, and his dead son's dog resting trustingly against his legs. It was a tableau of everything that was broken in my life, and everything that was still worth saving. Sometimes you don't realize you're drowning until someone throws you a rope, I continued, my voice barely above a whisper. And that dog, that beautiful, loyal creature, he was my rope. He looked up at me with those brown eyes that had seen too much, and I could swear he was saying, "Not yet, old man. We still got work to do." I set the gun back in the drawer, and instead wrapped my arms around Braveheart, burying my face in his fur the way I'd seen countless children do during our therapy visits. His warmth, his steady breathing, his absolute presence in that moment, it all served to anchor me back to the world of the living. A dog's love is the closest thing to grace this old world has to offer, I said, quoting something I'd heard at a veterans meeting years earlier. And grace, Pastor, grace is what saved me that night. We stayed like that for hours, the old man and the dog, both of us refugees from our own grief, both of us learning to lean on each other in ways we'd never expected. Somewhere around midnight, Braveheart had performed one of Danny's favorite tricks, an elaborate playbow followed by a gentle paw shake that my son had taught him during their time together overseas. That's when it hit me, Pastor. That dog wasn't just remembering Danny, he was keeping Danny alive. Every trick, every gesture, Every moment of comfort he provided was a living testament to my son's love. And if I gave up, if I took the easy way out, I'd be abandoning that legacy. The realization had come like dawn breaking over a battlefield, slow at first, then all at once, illuminating everything with painful clarity. I wasn't just responsible for my own life anymore. I was the guardian of Danny's memory, the keeper of stories that would die with me if I didn't find a way to pass them on. That night, I made a decision that changed everything. Instead of ending my story, I was going to make sure it had a proper ending. Instead of running from my condition, I was going to face it head on and use whatever time I had left to do something meaningful. I pulled out a worn notebook from my jacket pocket, its pages filled with my shaky handwriting. Started writing everything down that night, Pastor. Every story about Danny, every memory I could salvage from the wreckage of my mind. But more than that, I started making plans. The plans had been ambitious for a man in my condition: training programs for Jake, arrangements for Braveheart's continued care, even preliminary discussions with the school district about establishing a permanent therapy dog program in Danny's memory. Because here's what I realized, Pastor. My Alzheimer's isn't just taking away my memories. It's threatening to erase Danny's story entirely. But if I could train enough people, if I could set up the right systems, then maybe his memory would outlive my ability to remember it. Pastor Bill leaned forward, his eyes bright with understanding. You decided to create a legacy that could survive your condition. Exactly. And that dog, that beautiful, broken, loyal animal, he was going to be the centerpiece of it all. Not just as a therapy dog, but as a living reminder of what it means to love someone so completely that you never stop waiting for them to come home. I looked out the window at Braveheart, who was still waiting patiently in the truck, his ears perked up every time he caught sight of movement through the church windows. That dog had saved my life that dark Thursday night, not through any dramatic gesture, but simply by being present, by offering the kind of unconditional love that makes living worthwhile even when dying seems easier. The funny thing is, Pastor, I think Danny sent him to me, not in any supernatural way, but in the way that love has of finding its way back to where it's needed most. That dog needed someone who understood his grief, and I needed someone who could remind me why life is worth fighting for, even when your own mind becomes the battlefield. That's when the good Lord decided to show me what real forgiveness looks like. Pastor Bill refilled his coffee cup, the steam curling up between us like incense in the quiet office. Outside, the November afternoon was growing darker, and I could see Braveheart shifting restlessly in the truck, probably wondering why his old fool of a master was taking so long. It started with little Jake's school project about heroes. His teacher, Mrs. Anderson, had assigned the kids to write about someone they admired, someone who'd made a difference in their lives. And that boy, bless his heart, he chose me and Braveheart. The memory still warmed my chest like good whiskey on a cold night. Jake had come to my house after school that Tuesday, his backpack stuffed with poster board and colored markers, his young face serious with the weight of his assignment. "Grandpa Bobby," he said, settling down at my kitchen table with Braveheart at his feet, "I need to know about your war. The one you fought in, and the one Daddy Danny fought in, and the one you're fighting now with your brain." That 8-year-old boy had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things that would make a seasoned prosecutor weep with envy. He'd been watching, listening, understanding more than any of us had given him credit for. So I told him, Pastor. Told him about Vietnam, about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear our stories. Told him about Danny's tours in Afghanistan, about the nightmares and the therapy dog that helped him sleep through the night. And then, God help me, I told him about the Alzheimer's. Jake had absorbed it all with the gravity of a child who'd grown up too fast, who'd learned early that the world was full of pain and loss and unfairness. But instead of being scared or overwhelmed, he'd simply nodded and asked, "What can I do to help?" That's when I realized I'd been going about this all wrong, Pastor. I'd been so focused on carrying the burden alone, on protecting everyone from the truth, that I'd forgotten the most important lesson the Army ever taught me. A good soldier knows when to ask for backup. Over the next few days, Jake had thrown himself into the project with the enthusiasm only children can muster. He'd interviewed me for hours, taking careful notes in his neat, third-grade handwriting. He'd researched German shepherds and therapy dogs and military service. Most importantly, he'd started spending every afternoon at my house, learning everything I could teach him about caring for Braveheart. The boy had a natural gift with that dog, Pastor. Within a week, he could get Braveheart to perform commands that had taken me months to master. It was like watching Danny all over again. That same gentle confidence, that same intuitive understanding of what the dog needed. But the real miracle happened the following Friday, when Jake presented his project to the class. Mrs. Anderson had called me that afternoon, her voice thick with emotion, to tell me about it. "Mr. O'Sullivan," she said, "I've been teaching for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what your great-nephew did today. He didn't just give a presentation, he gave a testimony." Jake had stood in front of his classmates and talked about heroes who weren't perfect, who struggled with invisible wounds, who sometimes needed help remembering why life was worth living. He'd brought pictures of me in my Army uniform, of Danny with Braveheart in Afghanistan, of all of us together during our therapy visits. But here's the kicker, Pastor. He ended his presentation by saying, "My grandpa Bobby is teaching me that being a hero isn't about not being scared. It's about taking care of the people and animals you love, even when you're falling apart inside." The phone call from Mrs. Anderson had left me in tears. But they were good tears, the kind that wash away pain instead of adding to it. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt like maybe my condition could be a teacher instead of just a destroyer. That's when Melissa showed up at my door. She'd arrived on a Saturday morning, looking nervous and carrying a small bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. Through the window, I could see her new husband, Tom, waiting in their car with the engine running, ready for a quick getaway if things went poorly. "Bobby," she said, standing on my front porch with that baby in her arms, "I heard about Jake's school project. The whole town's talking about it. About you and Danny and the dog." She paused, looking down at her feet. "I was wondering if maybe you'd like to meet your step-granddaughter." The baby was beautiful, Pastor, with Danny's dark hair and her mother's green eyes. She couldn't have been more than 3 months old, all pink cheeks and tiny fingers that grabbed at everything within reach. And when I held her for the first time, when she looked up at me with those trusting eyes, something in my chest cracked wide open. "Her name is Grace," Melissa said, tears streaming down her face. "Grace O'Sullivan Thompson. I kept Danny's name as part of hers because I didn't want her to grow up not knowing she had a brother she'll never meet." But the real miracle happened when Braveheart met the baby. I'd been worried about how he'd react. German shepherds could be protective to a fault, and he'd never been around infants before. But that dog took one look at little Grace, and something in his entire posture changed. He went into what I can only call protection mode, Pastor. Positioned himself between the baby and the door, alert but calm, like he'd been appointed her personal guardian. And when Grace started fussing, Braveheart moved closer, letting her tiny hand grab at his fur while he remained perfectly still. Melissa had watched this interaction with wonder and something that looked like relief. "I've been so scared," she admitted, settling into my living room chair with Grace in her arms. "Scared that you'd never forgive me, scared that my new family would always be separate from Danny's memory, scared that I'd destroyed any chance of us being connected. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to remember differently," I told her, quoting something Pastor Bill had said to me years earlier. "And families aren't just about blood, sweetheart. They're about choosing to love each other despite our mistakes." That afternoon stretched into evening, And for the first time since Danny's funeral, Melissa and I really talked. Not about the dog, not about the secrets we'd been keeping, but about Danny himself. About the man he'd been, the father he would have wanted to be, the legacy he would have wanted to leave. She told me stories I'd never heard before, Pastor, about how Danny had talked about having children someday, about the names he'd liked, about how he'd wanted to teach his kids to fish and hunt and respect the land the way his grandfather had taught him. Grace had fallen asleep in my arms while we talked, her small body warm and trusting against my chest. Braveheart had maintained his vigil beside my chair, occasionally lifting his head to check on the baby, as if he understood that this tiny person was now part of his pack, part of his mission. And that's when it hit me, Pastor. That baby wasn't just Danny's stepsister. She was the future he'd been fighting for in Afghanistan. She was the next generation he'd wanted to come home to protect and love and guide. A family dog teaches you that love multiplies when you share it, I continued, watching Braveheart's gentle interaction with Grace. And sitting there with Melissa and her baby, with that dog keeping watch over all of us, I realized that Danny's family hadn't ended with his death. It had just taken a different shape. Tom eventually came to the door, worried about his wife and daughter, and I invited him in too. By the end of the evening, we had the beginnings of a plan, not just for Braveheart's care, but for keeping Danny's memory alive through the generations that would come after us. Sometimes the people who hurt you most become the people you need most, I told Pastor Bill, if you're brave enough to let forgiveness work its magic. So, Pastor, I reckon I done the right thing, even if I done it the wrong way. I leaned back in that old leather chair, feeling lighter than I had in months. The weight of confession, of finally speaking all these truths out loud, had lifted something heavy from my chest that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Pastor Bill set down his coffee cup and looked at me with those kind eyes that had seen so much human frailty and forgiveness over the years. Bobby, what you've done, it's remarkable. You've turned your pain into purpose, your loss into love. Well, there's one more thing I ain't told you yet, I said, pulling a folded document from my jacket pocket. Had my lawyer draw this up last week. It's a living will, but not the kind most folks make. This one's all about that dog out there. The document outlined everything, Braveheart's care rotating between my house, Melissa's family, and little Jake's parents. Doctor Morrison would oversee his medical care, and the elementary school had agreed to make him their official therapy dog. Every detail had been planned, every contingency accounted for. Jake's going to be his primary handler once I can't manage anymore. Melissa wants him to spend weekends with baby Grace, helping her grow up knowing about her big brother Danny. And when I'm gone, that dog will keep making visits to folks who need healing, carrying Danny's love forward into the world. Pastor Bill nodded slowly, understanding the full scope of what I'd orchestrated. You've created a living memorial. More than that, I said, standing up and walking to the window where I could see Braveheart waiting patiently in the truck. I've created a family, 4 generations connected by love and loyalty, and the understanding that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to keep loving the living. I turned back to Pastor Bill, feeling peace settle over me like a warm blanket. A man's not measured by what he takes to the grave, but by what he leaves walking around after he's gone. That dog out there, that boy Jake, baby Grace, even Melissa, they're all part of Danny's story now. And as long as they're breathing, as long as they're loving each other, my son's memory will keep walking this earth on 4 legs and in 4 hearts. Pastor Bill stood and placed his hand on my shoulder. Bobby, I believe you found your absolution, not from me, but from the work you've done to heal your family. I nodded, finally ready to go home to the dog who'd been waiting for me all afternoon, just like he'd once waited for my son. Sometimes life hands us broken pieces that don't seem to fit together anymore. Bobby O'Sullivan thought he'd lost everything. his son Danny to war, his wife Margaret to cancer, and now his memories to Alzheimer's. But when he found that dying German shepherd outside Miller's Hardware, he discovered something profound. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to keep walking around in the world. That abandoned dog wasn't just Danny's forgotten companion. He was a living bridge connecting 4 generations of family, teaching an 8-year-old boy about loyalty, comforting a new mother carrying guilt, and giving an old soldier one final mission worth fighting for. Bobby's story reminds us that our greatest legacies aren't the things we accumulate, but the love we leave behind in the hearts of others. Even when our minds fail us, even when we think we've lost everything that matters, grace has a way of showing up on 4 legs, with patient brown eyes and an unbreakable spirit. The question isn't whether we'll face loss and heartbreak. It's whether we'll have the courage to let love transform our pain into purpose, our endings into new beginnings. What memories or relationships in your own life have surprised you by becoming sources of healing rather than just reminders of loss? Have you ever discovered that caring for someone or something else helped you process your own grief? Share your story in the comments below. Our community needs to hear how love finds its way back to us when we least expect it.